Oh yeah, sexy biscuits. Nice.
Long boys blues, 1975. Using girls on the rise. Reviewing games late at night and sometimes friends. But Long boys blues, 1975.
Hey YouTube, Numbers Post 1975. I was talking to a couple of buddies of mine the other day, and they were talking about how utterly devastated they were when the Dreamcast was basically killed off by Sega, you know, and how because initially things looked so good for it, and then basically the PlayStation 2 came out and slaughtered it. And obviously there were other reasons within it, you know, dying. But it was a revolutionary console that had so much going for it, and like a lot of many other people, they were devastated when Sega pulled the plug on it. Obviously they kept supporting it software wise, as did other people, for a few years, but there's no denying that when the company themselves openly admit defeats, as to be fair, they did with the previous console, the Sega Saturn, and to some degree the 32X, and to some degree the Sega or the Mega CD, because I'm English. Mega, it's got Mega in the title, it's so much better than Sega CD. But I digress. So yeah, and they were saying they genuinely really were, you know, heartfelt upset at the death of the Dreamcast, or the end of the console's life, I should say. I mean, again, it was supported for a few years, but that's a nail in the coffin, isn't it? When the manufacturer themselves wave a white flag or chuck the towel in, if you will. And it got me thinking, and I was quite surprised at what it was, but it got me thinking about, of all the systems I've owned, which one I was genuinely, you know, even though you could argue I moved on to new pastures, quite, you know, a little bit upset, or sad I should say, maybe not upset, sad that it had come to the end of its life. I mean, it's an interesting question because there are factors in it, such as when you're a kid, you know, you don't have the disposable income that you do as an adult, assuming you do have disposable income as an adult. And so therefore you might not even necessarily have a current generation machine. You may be on the previous generation, and when I say that, you know, on the previous generation when literally no more software is being made for it, or you may even be on the previous generation, such as, you know, when the SNES and the Mega Drive are out there, you might be rocking an Atari 2600, which to be fair was still being sold in club books at that point, so that's kind of a moot point, but you know what I mean. And also the thing is, as you get older, you will have multiple systems and you will hang on to other systems, and when you become a retro gamer or collector, or both I should say, such as myself, then the machine is never really truly dead, because you're constantly, you know, collecting games for it and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of a, you know, a jumbled up question. My answer to this question is kind of going to be a little bit jumbled up, but I mean there are factors in it is what I'm trying to say. But if I had to come up with what system I was, you know, sad that it had come to the end of its life, you know, that's not just had the manufacturer pulled the plug on it, stopped making games themselves, and that other companies had stopped supporting it, you know, supporting it software wise and things like that. And yeah, it's not the ZX Spectrum, which is a bit weird. The ZX Spectrum, don't get me wrong, is a massive part of my childhood. I have a massive amount of love, respect and nostalgia for it. Absolutely loved it. It's the machine that defined gaming to me and my brothers, and a very large amount of people in this country as a child. Everything about it was fantastic. Affordability, piracy, allegedly. The fact that so many of your friends had the same system. You know, I've talked about this many times, immediately and instantly creating a software library for you outside of, you know, you even having to buy games. And as I said, you know, this library of other people or your mates having this machine meant that obviously you could then allegedly copy them. And also the wars with the other machines, or particularly the Commodore 64 and the magazines. Absolutely, you know, the magazines was a very specific part of what was great about, you know, having a ZX Spectrum as a kid. But it is not the machine that I was sad, you know, when it came to the end of its life. Something else I just want to touch upon, which I should have said at the start of this video. There's another factor in machines that you aren't necessarily, you know, sad or upset when you're jumping to the new generation or the new series machines or consoles or computers, and that would be backward compatibility, such as things like when you jump from the PlayStation to the PlayStation 2, you could literally take your library with you, and to some degree there were mild improvements, better loading times, slight graphical smoothing out, stuff like that. Although to be fair, I could never really notice that the many times I used to play Metal Gear Solid on my PlayStation 2, my original US copy, and also such as the GameCube to the Wii to the Wii U, and then obviously you could argue through the software emulation, the Xbox to the 360 to the Xbox One. That in itself takes, you know, bluntens the impact of something, you know, being discontinued or having its lifeline, you know, pulled on it and stuff like that. But yeah, so the Spectrum really wasn't that for me. I mean, we got ours in the year of launch, '82, and it's, you know, it's the last official game, I believe, was Nigel Mansell's Grand Prix or something like that. It was a Nigel Mansell racing game, which was 1992. But there were big titles and licenses, you know, by Ocean, you know, right up to the end, like '91, Terminator on it, big license, pants game. But yeah, it's not that machine. I mean, that, I think, and the more I think about it, and it certainly wasn't the Master System. I think you know where this answer is going. Even though that was kind of my first console, but that has a hand in why it wasn't the Spectrum. The Spectrum to me, because we were so much you know, in awe and love of the arcade as kids, because we were lucky enough to have many seaside holidays, which was at least then, still to some degree now, the preserve of the arcade, and so arcade gaming was, you know, where my heart was even before the Spectrum. And, you know, as crude as the Spectrum was, although to me, I can still play games on it and think they look good, but that's memories and nostalgic goggles and stuff like that. But it was about getting to play the arcade games, however crude or inferior their port was. It was about getting to play them on the Spectrum. In some cases, they were absolutely, you know, fantastic ports. Just look at Renegade. Just look at, I was going to say Double Dragon. And Chase HQ, and how I even think that Outrun was a pretty decent port, because it was a game that I loved so much in the arcade, and Space Harrier. But the point being, it was, I got to play these arcade games at home, so then I was on an onward you know, trajectory to always try and get to play as close as I could the arcade machines that I loved, particularly Sega, because I was a Sega fanboy from day one, thanks to the arcades, but to play them at home. So a big step up for me to get to that goal was the Sega Master System, and playing stuff like Double Dragon, which is a fantastic port, R-Type, Space Harrier. Space Harrier to me was one of the, you know, holy grails to be able to play at home, and it was, you know, it was certainly way better than the Spectrum. No idea what happened to my voice then. I have just had a KFC gravy burger. And yeah, so I mean, it was certainly, you know, way above the Spectrum, but again, there was still a massive gap. But again, and I bailed. I was like generation system jumping at this point, because I had so many part-time top jobs as a kid. I mean, I've talked about it so many times on this channel. So many part-time jobs as a kid that I had disposable income even when I was a kid, and so I was very fortunate in that I could, you know, system jump, and I was always importing stuff. You know, most of my systems were always imported from Japan because I could not wait. But so I bailed on the Master System. I absolutely love it, and again, like the Spectrum, possibly not as much, but do have a massive amount of love and nostalgia for it. But I bailed on it before its death, so it was still an active machine when I got my Japanese Mega Drive, which is the machine, I think you knew this was coming, I was the most saddened by when it officially became defunct. Even though, when it did, I, already, had imported a Super Famicom, and I was playing my imported Japanese PlayStation, and I don't even think, when I had my PlayStation, I don't even think I had my Japanese Mega Drive anymore at that point. But such was my love for the machine that a few years later, even during PlayStation, maybe 4 or 5 years into the PlayStation's life, I went and bought a second-hand PAL Mega Drive. It was PAL, so it was shit. But that was my love and appreciation of the system. But the reason I have such an attachment to it is that was my proper chance to experience near arcade. I know, I've talked about it many times on this channel. I have a series of videos called Arcade versus Home, but near arcade perfect conversions of some of my favourite arcade machines, and that is why I imported one from day one. That is why, for those first early years, particularly like the first 18 months, first year when I was the only kid, seriously, secondary school, to own one. The gaming on it was just amazing, absolutely fantastic. I mean, obviously I had to import all my games for like the first year, 18 months and stuff like that. But back then that was easier said than it was a few years later, because you used to go into places like the in-shops. Who remembers the in-shops? When they take old supermarkets and then they'd essentially turn it into a mini market inside where everyone would have stalls, and they called it the in-shops because it was like a franchise. So there was one in Bristol, in East Street, which obviously was incredibly close to me as a kid. So that was, where I could get my Japanese games. And there was one in Western Supermare, and they also had an import, Mega Drive, SNES, Master System shop, but they weren't, they just happened to be in each of these places. They weren't actually linked to each other or anything like that, even though the in-shops was a franchise. But it wasn't a pain in the ass. It was, later, well, unless it wasn't like this where you lived, to get these import games. But just getting these games, to experience these machines that I loved, and I know they weren't arcade perfect, but to the untrained eye as a kid, especially when you were sucked in by all the magazines who, they flamed, they put, fuel on flames of this by constantly referring to it as arcade perfect themselves, or better than, with extra content. And then obviously a few years later as an adult you would know, or if you played the machine, like when I used to take my Mega Drive on holiday when we were still going to like very very rarely seaside towns in case it was raining, and then I could literally play a game on it and then go to the arcade and then play the same game and just go, oh my god, I was wrong all these years. It's far from arcade perfect, but the point being, to me then as a kid with kid eyes, one of my dreams had been fulfilled, and that was I got to play the arcade at home. And I'm hoping you probably realise that, I'm guessing you probably realise that if you've watched any of my videos, vlogs, and I talk about these things, that the arcade was such a big part to me, that really was an achievement to get to play it at home. The other reason why I have a massive attachment to the system was it was my first 100% bought, paid for, imported by me. The Master System, yeah, I worked and saved up half of it, and obviously my parents gave me the other half for Christmas, and it was truly my first system. That was mine entirely. But the Mega Drive was something where as soon as I knew it was coming out and I had to have it, I was driven to get it, absolutely driven to get it. It was 100% funded by me, found in a black and white, a reputable import company in the back of CVG. Did all my homework on PAL, SCART, stuff like that, 60 hertz and things like this. Had to buy a new TV. So these are all things that just meant that the Mega Drive was literally, bold statement, I know, almost like a family member. That was my attachment to it. So it was completely and utterly mine. I felt a massive sense of achievement in how I went about getting it, and the fact that it delivered my beloved arcade experience at home. These are all things that just meant that it was, even back then, it was a massive deal to me, and I was just completely and utterly in love with it. And so obviously at some point I got a Super Famicom, and they lived side by side for a bit. I think the Super Famicom, Super Famicom was less of an arcade machine really as such. I mean, there were ports on it, but it didn't, and maybe because Sega were the big hitters in the arcades, in the 80s, more so than any other company, um, that it didn't have these library of games that it, would be on it. So it didn't really feel as much as a, you know, experience in the arcades to me at home. Again, I know there's stuff like Sunset Riders and there's a whole heap of, ports on it and stuff like that, and Konami stuff and that, but the lack of Sega on it, obvious reasons, I am aware of that, meant that I never quite had the attachment and love to it that I had to the Mega Drive. And so, even though when I was in, import PlayStation days, I'd sold my Japanese Mega Drive at that point. I'd actually swapped my Super Famicom for a fucking, I'm not gonna lie, a shit hot double CD Pioneer stack system, when Pioneer were the dog's bollocks, and it was a stereo that I could never afford myself, and a whole bunch of other stuff. As an adult, I regret that deeply, but the point being, when I was in PlayStation land, I no longer had a Mega Drive, but I still had these attachments to it. And since at this point I was reading multi-format magazines because I wanted to know, about all the new systems coming out and all the new games coming out, I wanted to know about Saturn stuff, import stuff, CDI to some degree, 3DO, everything. I wanted to know about it. I would always buy multi-format magazines. So I would still, even though I didn't own it, see these games, releases getting thinner and thinner and thinner and trickling out, but would still see these games coming out on the Mega Drive. And even though I didn't own one, and at this point I didn't want one, it was a few years away from me buying a crap power one again, but I would read them. I would read the magazines, and I would take in what they said about that. They were rinsing every ounce of power out of this machine, like stuff like Batman and Robin, stuff like Comic Zone, things like that, balls and things that they were really pushing the limits of this machine, and and it like the stuff they were achieving was fantastic, and I was still very vested in it. I was like vested in it because it was such a big part to me, years earlier. And like I said, the arcades at home were my first truly my system. I mean, the Master System was, but you know what I mean, I paid for every inch of this bad boy myself. And so I was very much still vested in it. I'd still be looking for, the next PlayStation game I would buy or import or stuff like that. I remember there was a place over the road from where I worked as a labourer in St George that sold import consoles. They had like Neo Geos, like that was ever going to happen. PlayStation, Japanese PlayStation, Japanese Saturn, stuff like that. And I used to buy games in there before, the UK release, and I realised you could just put blue tack in it to stop the lid turning the power off when it went up and disc swapping, and I bought a couple games in there, Motor 2 and GP, Battle Arena, Toshinden, and stuff that I can't remember, but they were £75 a pop. But the point being, even though I was dropping money like that, crazy money on the PlayStation, I'm loving every minute of it because it was like, the biggest leap generation wise we would see. I still think to some degree we will, never see a leap like that again. Obviously the birth of 3D and early 3D looking as crude and shite as it did back then, stuff like Ridge Racer, hell, even Cyber Sled, which came bundled with mine, was just mind-blowing. But the point being, I would still, love reading about these Mega Drive games that were trickling out, but you would see it literally, one, maybe two if you're extremely lucky, because this is what, 94? 95, 94 was when I got mine, because that was the Japanese launch of the PlayStation. But and then it stopped, and I was genuinely sad. Like this wonderful, and it didn't end because it wasn't successful. Like the Dreamcast, we're talking about these people who kind of inspired this question at the start of this video. It didn't end like the Dreamcast. Go out on a whimper or have its live support turned off. It hung in there, it was a big hitter. Hell, it beat the SNES, which you could argue, well, slower processor, graphically, sonically superior machine, even though I've always preferred the sound on the Mega Drive, because again, to me, it's more akin to the arcade sound than that kind of orchestral, however advanced it was, amazing Sony chip in the Super Famicom. But, yeah, it hung in there, and there were big titles all the way up to the end, and obviously I am aware that it's, you know, life, you know, ran on for years and years and years in Brazil and stuff like that, but I'm talking, you know, officially in the United Kingdom. And again, even though when it was dead, people would still have it, and there would still be a very active, you know, second-hand market for, you know, not like now retro game wise, but for a few years afterwards. But the point is, when I saw these games no longer appearing in these multi-format magazines, and I knew that, you know, that was it. And obviously Sega were working on, and I don't mean, you know, like the 32X and that, but you know, I knew, because we were in Saturn Town. I wasn't, my brother Jason was. So Sega had, you know, moved on to never experience the dizzying high success-wise, can't talk, of the Mega Drive again. But when I saw the last games in these magazines, and I'm not talking 32X here, you know, or enhancements or anything like that, and we're in Saturn Town, as I said, I'm talking about genuine standalone Mega Drive games, gone, and that was it. I was genuinely sad, genuinely sad. Felt like, you know, an old friend had passed on, if you will. I know that sounds a bit strong, but literally, you know, since 98, 88, it was, yeah, it, like, all the attachment I had to it, and how much it, you know, it blew my mind, and how much I loved gaming on it and inviting mates over who never even knew this was a thing and stuff like that. All these memories and that literally made it like a friend. And so that point, when it was official that, you know, it was done, it was dusted, genuinely sad. I mean, I guess the people who were upset of the Dreamcast, you know, are so because it had so much potential, and for whatever reasons, this is not that sort of video. It never really truly got to fulfill them. Although, don't get me wrong, obviously there's amazing games on it. It's a fantastic library. But the point is, that you know, that was a whole bunch of stuff in itself. That died. Sega killed it, I should say. And then its, you know, life support game-wise was incredibly limited, because then as a company they jumped onto just being software producers. But the Mega Drive was there, you know, for such a long part of my childhood, even when, and very early adulthood, even, you know, when I was on, you know, far, you know, technically superior machines and stuff like that, I would still, you know, keep my you know, my head around what was going on in Mega Drive Town, because, yeah, this kind of got away from me. I'm waffling a little bit here, but the point being, of all the systems, and I was very surprised when I thought about this, because initially I thought it was going to be the Spectrum, hands down, and the more I thought about it, and as I've explained in this vlog, yeah, it was the Mega Drive. Yes, it was such a big part of my gaming as a child in my early sort of adult years and things like that. Young adult years, granted. That was the most sad. I've never been, you know, saddened by the death of a system. Death is too strong. The end of its natural life, I should say. It's not like we took it out back and shot it, like the Dreamcast. The end of its natural life, you know, old age, stuff like that. I've never ever, you know, felt, you know, sad about having to let go of a generation, even though I knew a new one was coming, or I have to embrace a new generation, you know, by saying goodbye to an old generation. I've never ever felt any of them. I mean, I've done videos about them being like, you know, kind of a little bit gutted that they're gone, but never felt sad about the demise of a system, period, apart from the Mega Drive. So, apologies, this has kind of got away from me, but as always, I'd love to know what you think. I'd love you to explain the reasons why, or maybe everyone else just accepts it as a natural, you know, process of the life of systems and generations and things like that. What were you genuinely gutted about, or system you were genuinely saddened about, when its time had, you know, had come and there was no more games were being created for it? Obviously it didn't stop your enjoyment of it, but the point being, knowing that it was a done deal. Which one were you sad about? Or maybe you weren't, as I said, maybe it's just me, and maybe I should get a white stick. Anyways, always, I'd love to know what you think. Thank you very much for persevering through this. I'll see you later.